This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
So our world is a fascinating and wondrous place. It is our sanctuary, but it's also our cesspool. But I'm not here today to talk to you about climate change, or pollution, or deforestation, or any of the big issues that currently confront us. Because these are actually just issues, they're problems to be solved. So what I'd like to do is expose a flaw in our global community that's undermining our efforts to solve these problems. I'm here today to talk about governance as well as democracy. But it's not your grandfather's democracy that I'm talking about. I'm talking about a new world where the power of individual people is uncovered and harnessed like never before. So, even monkeys play at politics, and for as long as there have been people on this planet, there have been politicians, right? And humanity has increasingly settled upon the democratic system as the best method of governance. For example, 50 years ago, there were only 40 democratic countries, and now there's over 123. And yet, even within these democracies, the struggle between the people and the powerful few continues. A privileged minority still exerts disproportionate influence, because democracy really isn't perfect. It's just a better way than many other ways that we've tried in the past. So I'd really like to ask, how could it be possible in this modern day and age that anyone can make payments to a politician and subvert the interests of the voters? In a true democracy, all political funding would come from the people as a whole, not from lobbyit.com, where you can buy your way into the political system. So I'm actually here to talk about these things today because democracy as we know it is woefully inadequate. It's simply not good enough. Democracy today is, number one, slow. Number two, it's biased. Three, it's inaccurate. And at the same time, it's expensive. So, these are some pretty fundamental flaws. For the first time ever, however, the time and the means are now upon us that we could improve democracy and push it much closer to the original ideological principles. So we should ask ourselves a couple questions. For example, is it okay for someone to remain in office for 2 or 4 years, even if we collectively want to change the system right now? Another example, if I like some policies of a given politician while absolutely abhorring others, why should I be forced into an all or nothing voting scenario? And then also, is it okay that we can only afford to hold an election every so many years? This is Australian data, how much it's cost for these elections. It's simply too expensive to be more granular with our measure of whether or not a government is being accountable to its people. So another one is it okay to accept many people's votes in a democratic election going uncounted due to technicalities with the voting process? Whole outcomes of elections could actually be completely wrong, and yet we accept this fallibility as part of the system. And why is it that we're prepared to wait for days, weeks, and sometimes months for elections to be tallied while the technology exists so that we could do this stuff in real time today? The technology already exists. I'm pretty sure that most of you in the room today would think that none of these things are necessarily okay. We can improve upon the current systems. We have the ability to craft a much finer, more intuitive, more interactive version of democracy. And we're doing it already with social opinion online, as we actually heard earlier today. So how should it be that how can we integrate and move this governance system forward? So even though I've provided all this kind of criticism, I think we should really be very optimistic about our future. Because there have been some recent events that clearly demonstrate how much change is already taking place. So for example, a landmark event occurred during Obama's campaign. By using the internet to gather small donations from a very large number of relatively powerless people, Obama changed the face of the democratic process, which brings us to an interesting insight, a key insight. Given the right catalyst, democracy thrives through the power of the individual. Individuals of like-mindedness can come together and harness their collective power to create change. there is a collective consciousness that bubbles up from each individual in the group. And this consciousness governs the way in which the group behaves. So in science, this is actually called complex adaptive theory. And it explains how simple elements self-organize into complex entities known as superorganisms. So I'll use this term a couple times, superorganisms. So for example, two researchers in this field, Holdebler and Wilson, they said that ants, like human beings, can create civilizations without the use of reason. You know, they're working together, yet there's no central component. So maybe tell a small story. So sometime between 120 and 190 million years ago, some cockroaches began to live in colonies and started to feed on rotting wood. The various members of this colony then started to specialize in their behaviors, such as defending, foraging, or in this case, reproducing, working together for the group as a whole. And these colonies eventually evolved into termites, and the world's first superorganism was born. So termites differ from us in many ways, of course. But like us, they are each a part of a superorganism. So sometimes language does get in our way. So for example, we call the social entity of an insect a superorganism, but we call the social entity of humans a nation, civilization, or a nation. So they're really actually the same thing. The superorganism is central to our understanding of interconnectedness. And the superorganism is more competent and productive than the sum of the individual parts. So one of the things that's happening that we're seeing now is that there's actually like a human cultural evolution. And it's driving humans towards this transformation into a global superorganism. So the invention of the internet, mobile phones, and cheap air travel are dramatically challenging the capabilities of the old human superorganisms, which we know as the nations. So what I think is interesting about this is that this global superorganism for us, it's actually held together by ideas instead of the genetic relatedness of insects. And that's pretty much the only fundamental distinction, because we're held together by the ideas. And I think the most interesting thing here is that we're actually still evolving. So if you put yourself in this frame of reference, really, the interconnectedness amongst us, we haven't actually realized or harnessed the power of this yet. So in many respects, we're kind of like roach mites. You know, we're sort of in the primordial ooze of this evolution, and yet we still sort of don't really know about it yet. So, you know, we're all on our way to a better place than we are now. So this interconnectedness would allow us to solve our global problems much more efficiently. So what can we do to expedite this evolution? Well, there's at least one mechanism that I know of that short-circuits this whole thing, and I call it radical inclusion. It's not something we could have done 20 years ago, and even 10 years ago, it would have been extremely difficult without the internet and mobile devices. So we've reached a maturity in our technology and the infrastructure that enables this opportunity. It's an opportunity to surface problems anywhere in the world that are affecting this global superorganism, and actually provide an opportunity to improve what we're doing, you know, self-regulation. So radical inclusion is a vehicle for shifting the collective consciousness of this superorganism we're a part of. It breaks down the barriers of geography, of language, and of politics. So there's at least one there's at least one thing we've started to see. For example, what's happened in terms of just recently here in the video here in Christchurch, for example. If you have a look at what's happened here, like this is one person anywhere in the world uploading a video to the internet and having hundreds of, well, in this case hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of people watching this piece of communication. So what's happened here is that the ideas can spread, and as you can see, like just over the past day or two, it's like almost every country in the world, this is one of the top rated pieces of content. So it's interesting to see because, you know, it's the speed in which these opinions can form and how these can be mobilized. You know, those are the unique attributes of this. And so this phenomenon is, of course, absolutely supported by the internet, but we're not solely relying upon it. So for example, and actually we highlighted this earlier as well, so it's the speak-to-tweet things that were happening with the Egyptian protests, and now it's actually gone beyond into Libya and other parts of the world. The government thought they could block the internet and thereby control this force, but the desire for people to connect en masse is simply too great. So people have found ways around it. And so with over 3.3 billion active mobile phones, and many people being able to access the internet in many other ways, you know, through internet cafes and other means, you can see the possibility of globally participative democracy that can circumvent the existing powers of the state. So we can achieve radically inclusive democracy right now. We can do it today with our existing technologies and infrastructure. So radically inclusive democracy is, number one, fast. Number two, it's unbiased, it's accurate, and it's also inexpensive. And I think that's really a fundamental piece of it, is the expense that's involved with all this. So for example, it's fast, which means because the whole thing is online, so the voting and statistics are instantly available and accessible from anywhere. Analytics can be more than just website metrics and stuff, just as an example. And then also unbiased, because the process is completely transparent. Voting could happen anywhere. Voting could happen in the privacy of your own home. It could be on a mobile device. It could be in an internet cafe. And radically inclusive democracy completely disempowers intimidators. So, if you've got someone pointing a gun at your head and saying vote in a particular way, you can go and change it later, from a different place anywhere in the world. So it really does start to shift the entire character of what we think of in terms of democracy. And of course, the accuracy statement, as I highlighted before, there'd be no more accuracy problems due to the manual counting process. And no votes would go missing, and kind of most of the human error would be eradicated. So it's accountable, which is a big part of it as well, because anyone can check the accuracy of their voting record at any time. So, and then I think one of the most important ones here as well being inexpensive. So it's powered by the free and open internet. It would be accessible to all countries, whether they're big or small, or rich or poor. So the cost to run an election would no longer be an inhibiting factor. So you can imagine what that might do as well to shift the way it works today. And so the global community benefits from having this kind of transparent democratic process. And having for the first time, what this does also is it allows you to have global votes. Like for example, right now, the Secretary General of the UN is voted in by a handful of his colleagues and peers. What would happen if we could actually vote in the people into these larger places like the United Nations from a global perspective? So climate change would be a good example of a way that this could help with those kind of issues. And of course, we could throw darts at this. I'm sure you're thinking about things like authentication or access to the internet. So I guess my first argument would be to say if we could put a man on the moon within 10 years of wanting to do that, and that was done with less computing power than the phone that I'm putting that picture on today, then surely these are just implementation issues we could get past. And so in terms of access as well, there's also this issue of developing countries. Well, there's a company called O3B. It's a group that's come together, and they're actually, what O3B stands for is the other 3 billion, so it's the other 3 billion that don't have access to the internet. So making internet access affordable for everyone on the planet and delivering this through a constellation of satellites that are already up in the air across the equatorial countries. And then for authentication, there's already systems that are being used. There's one called Green ID, which this is an example of, which is used in the banking sector that does 100-point identification of bank accounts online without anyone ever having to walk into a branch. So, this opportunity is ripe. Technologically, we pretty much have what we need to do this. And I think also what we would say is in the banking areas, right? For example, anyone who uses online banking implicitly already believes that we have sufficient authentication to be able to do the things we need to do in this world and to identify ourselves, right? So it's not such a leap to apply this to the voting system. So, and yes, we'd never be able to do this, 100% online, because there'd be people in certain scenarios that you wouldn't be able to get online. But imagine if you could remove all of these resources and then only have to handle the maybe 10% of people that you'd have to do with a manual vote. It would to completely improve accuracy of the whole system. So lately it's become fashionable to assume the worst, to imagine that our global civilization has passed its peak and will soon collapse. Yet we should take solace from the fact that from the very beginning, we've loved one another and lived in the company of one another. And through giving up much, we've lived strong and formed the single greatest power on earth. So these simple traits of love and ingenuity have allowed the weakest of us to collectively triumph, to establish agriculture, business, and democracy in the face of opposition. I mean, things that you would have never thought possible we've done. And of course, we've hated and we've fought. But all the time that was happening, villages turned into cities, and cities have turned into megacities, until at last this global superorganism has been formed, although it hasn't properly matured yet. We've got to leave it in the cellar a little longer, I think. And so radically inclusive democracy is a step in this evolutionary trail. We're the first global superorganism to ever exist, and if we really are the first intelligent superorganism, then we should strive to identify and make the changes necessary to create a sustainable future for us all. And we've actually already taken steps down this path already. In 2009, I worked with some guys from the United Nations to develop a voting platform online. And what we did was distributed electronic ballot boxes across thousands of websites, including sites like Earth Hour. And so all this was inviting people to show basically show their vote of support for a strong outcome at the COP15, the Copenhagen Climate Summit. So at the time, I didn't see this as a step towards this radically inclusive democracy, because we were focused on bringing accountability to advocacy. And while the COP15, of course, failed to deliver this strategic objective, this platform made some significant advances in web-based democracy. It doesn't have everything it needs to enable radically inclusive democracy, but it's actually it's part of the way there, and it's an open source platform. So what does the future hold? Will radically inclusive democracy help to perfect the way we respond to crises against humanity? Will it allow us to harness the power of individuals to affect global change at speed and do what's right for us all? I honestly believe that it's more possible now than it ever has been in the past. I mean, the world is different now. And we all feel this innately, and it's only a matter of time before our social systems will adapt and take advantage of these changes. So let's make it happen now. Thank you. Thanks.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.